Sophia's wedding day was supposed to be the most perfect day of her entire life. The garden venue was draped in white roses and silk ribbons. Champagne glasses sparkled under afternoon sunlight. Guests in expensive outfits chatted and laughed, filling the air with the kind of laughter that only money seems to buy. Sophia stood near the entrance in a breathtaking ivory gown, diamonds circling her slender neck like a crown she believed she was born to wear. Everything was exactly as she had planned, until an old man in torn, muddy clothes shuffled toward the gate. He moved slowly, his back bent with age, a worn canvas bag hanging from one shoulder. His shoes had holes in them. His face was weathered and deeply lined, the way a face gets when it has seen decades of hardship. He carried no gift. He had no invitation. He simply stood at the entrance of the venue, looking around quietly, as though searching for someone he had lost a long time ago. "Stop right there," Sophia said, cutting through the crowd with the kind of cold authority she had practiced since childhood. She walked up to the old man, her heels clicking against the stone pathway like a warning. Her bridesmaids fell silent. Her mother turned to watch. "What exactly do you think you're doing here?" The old man blinked, his eyes soft and patient. "I apologize, miss. I'm looking for the Harrison family. I believe this is where—" "Get out." Sophia's voice was a blade. "This is a private event for people who actually belong here, not for beggars looking for a free meal." She stepped closer, dropping her voice to something sharper and more personal. "Look at yourself. You smell like the street. You have mud on your hands. These are guests who paid for their outfits more than you probably earned in your entire life. You have absolutely no right to be standing here." The old man didn't flinch. He simply looked at her with something unreadable in his eyes. Not hurt, not anger. Something quieter than both. "I meant no offense to anyone," he said gently. "I only wanted to—" "Security!" Sophia called out, waving her hand toward the two men stationed near the entrance. "Remove him immediately, and if he argues, call the police." She turned back to her guests with a practiced smile, smoothing the front of her gown. "I'm so sorry about that, everyone. Some people simply don't understand what boundaries are." The guards grabbed the old man's arms and walked him firmly toward the gate. He did not resist. He did not shout. He only glanced back once, briefly, and in that single look was something Sophia would spend the rest of her life trying to forget. A look that carried neither shame nor hatred, only a sorrow so deep it seemed to come from somewhere beyond this moment entirely. The guests applauded softly. Someone made a joke about wedding crashers. Sophia laughed along with them, tossing her hair with a practiced elegance that she had perfected over years of carefully curating every impression she made on the world. She had no idea that the man being escorted out the gate was the father of the man she was about to marry, and she had absolutely no idea that within the hour, the entire world she had so carefully constructed would begin to collapse around her feet. You are about to witness a story that is changing the way people think about what it truly means to have dignity. This isn't simply a story about wealth and poverty. It is about a bride who confused cruelty with class, and a family whose worth she completely failed to see. Where are you watching from today? Perhaps Atlanta, Chicago, Houston, or Miami. Maybe London, Sydney, Toronto, Dubai, Lagos, Mumbai, or Johannesburg. Tell us in the comments below. Hit that like button to help this story reach the people who need to hear it most. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that how we treat others says everything about who we truly are. Subscribe so you never miss a story that touches the heart and stirs the soul. Stay with us until the very end, because the most important lesson in this story isn't about who has money. It's about who has character. And sometimes those are two very different things. The morning had started with so much promise. Sophia Harrison, born Sophia Whitmore, had spent 3 years engineering this moment. The Harrison family name was one of the most respected in the entire city. Old money, generational wealth, a name that opened every door without knocking. When she first met Daniel Harrison at a charity gala 2 years ago, she recognized immediately that he represented the life she had always believed she deserved. Not just comfort, not just security, legacy. Sophia had grown up in a middle-class neighborhood, the daughter of a secondary school teacher and a pharmacist. They were kind people, decent people. But Sophia had decided early in her life that decent wasn't enough. She had watched wealthy families from a distance with a hunger that never fully went away, studying them the way a scientist studies a species, learning their habits and their language until she could imitate both perfectly. By the time she was 25, almost no one would have guessed where she actually came from. She had changed her accent, her wardrobe, her entire social circle. She had climbed deliberately and without apology. Daniel Harrison was gentle, thoughtful, and deeply private. He didn't talk much about his family. Sophia never pushed too hard because she assumed she already understood everything that mattered. The Harrisons were wealthy. That was the only fact she needed. She never asked where the wealth came from. She never asked about the older generation, grandparents, uncles, fathers. In her mind, the past was irrelevant as long as the future was secure. What she didn't know, what she had never bothered to find out, was that Daniel Harrison's father, a man named George Harrison, had spent the last 12 years living a life Sophia would have found incomprehensible. Not because of bad fortune, not because of failure, but by choice. George had once been the founder of the Harrison Group, the construction and real estate empire that now bore his family name. He had built it from nothing, with calloused hands and a stubborn refusal to quit. In the years when Daniel was just a boy watching his father leave before sunrise and return after dark, George had made his son's future possible with every single one of those years. But when Daniel turned 20 and the company was handed to him, George did something no one expected. He walked away from the boardroom, donated the bulk of his personal fortune to several charitable foundations, and chose to spend his remaining years traveling quietly, staying in modest places, helping wherever he could with the quiet energy of a man who had already proven everything he needed to prove. He wore simple clothes. He asked for nothing. He moved through the world without announcement, and that was exactly how he preferred it. He had returned to the city for one reason only. His son was getting married. He had received Daniel's handwritten letter 3 weeks ago. Tucked inside was a photograph of the two of them from Daniel's childhood, sitting on a dusty construction site at sunset, both of them eating sandwiches and laughing. George had held that photo for a long time before packing his bag. He would not miss this day for anything in the world. He had written back to Daniel in his careful, unhurried handwriting, the same handwriting that had once signed contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, simply and without ceremony. "I will be there. Save me a seat. Don't make a fuss. I'll find my own way." That was George Harrison in its entirety. No limousines, no announcements. He had taken a bus from the station on the edge of the city, walked the last 2 kilometers with his canvas bag over his shoulder, and arrived at the gate of his son's wedding looking exactly like a man who had spent his morning on a bus and his afternoon walking in the sun. He had not expected the reception he received, but he had not been surprised by it either. He had been dismissed at doors before. That was the reality of moving through the world as he had chosen to move through it, simply without the external signals that told people a person mattered. He had learned long ago that most people read those signals and nothing else, and that the reading was not malicious but reflexive, a survival shorthand the world had taught them. He pitied them for it sometimes. He had pitied Sophia in that moment, briefly and genuinely, before letting the feeling go. What he had not anticipated was finding her on the other side of the door. The ceremony proceeded beautifully. Sophia floated down the aisle on her father's arm, radiant and poised, every element of her appearance calculated to perfection. Daniel stood at the altar looking at her with a tenderness that made several guests quietly wipe their eyes. He loved her. That much was clear to everyone in the room. He loved the version of her he had come to know, the warmth she showed him in private, the laughter they shared on quiet evenings. What he didn't know yet was what had happened at the gate. No one told him. The guards had quietly handled the situation. The incident with the old man had been smoothed over before Daniel ever noticed anything unusual. Sophia had made sure of that, redirecting guests with a bright smile and a quick subject change. By the time they exchanged their vows, the moment had been buried beneath champagne and applause. It was during the reception dinner, as guests settled into their seats and waiters moved gracefully between the tables, that everything shifted without warning. The double doors of the reception hall opened quietly. No dramatic entrance, no announcement. Just a gentle push and the figure of an elderly man stepping into the room, clean now, wearing a simple dark suit that was well-fitted but modest, his white hair brushed back neatly. His posture was straight, his expression was calm. Daniel looked up from the head table, his face transformed completely. He stood so suddenly his chair scraped loudly against the floor, and he crossed the room in long, quick strides. "Dad!" His voice broke on the single word. He embraced the old man tightly, both arms wrapped around him, the way a person holds someone they were afraid they might never see again. "You came. You actually came." George Harrison held his son and patted his back slowly. "I told you I would be here. I always keep my word." Around the room, murmurs moved from table to table like a current. Daniel's friends exchanged glances. The older guest nodded with recognition. Sophia sat perfectly still at the head table, her champagne glass paused halfway to her lips. She stared at the old man her husband was embracing. Her mind worked quickly, reaching for an explanation that would make this anything other than what it clearly was. But the pieces clicked together with a sickening finality. The torn clothes, the muddy shoes, the canvas bag, the soft voice saying, "I'm looking for the Harrison family." The champagne glass landed back on the table with a sharp, ringing sound. George Harrison was guided to the seat that had been reserved for him at the head table, directly beside Daniel. He settled into the chair with the ease of someone who needs no fuss made on their behalf. Daniel was still holding his father's hand, his eyes bright with emotion. He looked at Sophia with a smile full of pride. "Sophia, I want you to meet my father, the man who built everything our family has. He rarely comes to the city anymore. He prefers the quiet life these days." He squeezed his father's shoulder. "But he's here today because today mattered more than quiet." The table went completely still. George turned and looked at Sophia for the first time since she had ordered him removed from her wedding. His eyes were exactly as she remembered, patient, steady, carrying that same unreadable depth that she had dismissed as the dullness of poverty when she first encountered them. Now, sitting across from her in a reception hall that bore his family's name, those eyes told a different story entirely. Sophia could not speak. Her chest had turned to ice. The entire carefully built architecture of this moment, the gown, the flowers, the guests, the name she had worked 3 years to acquire, felt like it was made of paper, and she could feel it beginning to dissolve in the rain. Daniel looked between them with growing unease. "Have you two met before?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing Sophia had ever heard. George placed his napkin gently across his lap, his movement unhurried. When he spoke, his voice carried no bitterness, no desire to wound. He spoke the way a man speaks when he is simply telling the truth. "We did meet briefly, at the gate before the ceremony. There was a small misunderstanding." Daniel frowned. "What kind of misunderstanding?" Sophia found her voice at last. It came out thinner than she intended. "I didn't know who he was. I would never have—" She stopped. The sentence had nowhere safe to go. George tilted his head slightly, a gesture that was somehow both kind and devastating. "She asked me to leave," he said simply. "She felt I wasn't dressed appropriately for the occasion. She was quite direct about it." He paused. "She was only doing what she believed was right. I hold no anger toward her for it." Daniel stared at his wife. The color had drained from his face. "You had my father removed from our wedding." "I didn't know," Sophia began. "You had an elderly man removed from a gathering because of how he was dressed." Daniel's voice was quiet in the way that quiet can be more frightening than shouting. "That's what happened. That's who you chose to be in that moment." The table around them had gone absolutely silent. Nearby guests had stopped their own conversations. The music in the background continued, indifferent and bright, the cruelest possible contrast to the stillness at the head table. Sophia looked at George. She was searching his face for something. Anger she could argue against, coldness she could appeal to, any emotion that would give her something to push back on. But there was only that same quietness, that same patience that had nothing to prove and no score to settle. I made a mistake, Sophia said, her voice barely holding together. I am genuinely sorry. I didn't know who you were. George looked at her for a long moment. I understand that, he said, but I want to ask you something honestly, and I hope you'll answer honestly in return. He folded his hands on the table. If I had arrived today in a tailored suit, in a car with a driver, would you have spoken to me differently? The question settled over the table like a stone dropping into still water. Sophia opened her mouth, closed it, her eyes filled with tears she hadn't anticipated. She was a person who rarely cried. She had trained herself out of it years ago, understanding early that emotion was vulnerability, and vulnerability was weakness. But sitting across from this quiet old man, who asked her a question with no cruelty in it at all, she felt something inside her beginning to crack along a fault line she hadn't known was there. She didn't answer, because she already knew the answer, and so did everyone else at the table. Daniel stood slowly. He was not a man who moved with drama or performed his emotions for an audience. He simply stood, placed his napkin beside his plate, with the careful deliberateness of someone making a decision they have already fully made, and turned to his father. Dad, I want you to sit with me tonight. I want to hear everything about your last 12 years. I want to know every place you've been and every person you've helped. He looked at Sophia one more time, and the look held no hatred, only a grief so honest it was almost harder to bear than anger. I need some time to think, he said quietly. We'll speak tomorrow. He walked his father to a quieter table near the window, away from the crowd, and the two men sat together in the gentle light, talking in low voices while the reception continued around them. Sophia remained at the head table. Around her, conversation slowly, carefully resumed. People looked away from her with the polite mercy of those who have witnessed something they wish they hadn't. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her untouched champagne going warm in its glass, and she thought about a door and an old man and the single moment she had chosen to be exactly the person she had spent her whole life telling herself she wasn't. Before she left the reception hall that night, Sophia sat for a long time at the head table alone. The candles had burned low, the music had stopped, the catering staff moved quietly around her, clearing plates and folding linens, careful to give her the privacy of invisibility. She sat with her hands in her lap and stared at the seat where George Harrison had sat across from her. The empty chair, the untouched flute of champagne the staff had poured for him, the simple elegance with which he had occupied that space and asked her a question she couldn't answer. She replayed the morning, the entrance, the gate, the old man moving slowly up the path. She had felt in that moment so certain, so clear in her judgment. She had looked at his shoes and made a complete and total calculation about who he was and what he was worth and what her wedding deserved to be protected from. The certainty of it, that was what frightened her now. Not that she had made a mistake, but how effortlessly the mistake had come. How natural it had felt to raise her hand and call for security. How her voice had carried no hesitation at all. She thought about all the other gates she had stood at in her life, waving people away from things she had decided they had no right to. Old classmates whose numbers she had quietly stopped returning when her social life improved. Her cousin, who still worked at the pharmacy where her father once worked, whom she had stopped inviting to things years ago because she worried about the impression he created. Her mother's friends, kind and plain-spoken and utterly genuine, whom she had learned to limit to brief visits rather than linger with in public. She had been building walls her entire adult life and calling them standards. The last guest left. A waiter politely asked if she needed anything else. She shook her head. She walked out into the cool evening air alone, her wedding gown gathered in one hand, and she stood at the very gate where she had delivered her verdict on an elderly man that morning, and she let herself fully understand what she had done. The days that followed were quieter than any Sophia had ever known. Daniel was not cruel. He was never cruel. He gave her space and asked only for honesty, the same quiet honesty his father had modeled for him his entire life. He asked her one question, the same question George had asked, and waited for the real answer. Not the practiced one, not the socially acceptable one, the real one. It took her 4 days to give it to him. In those 4 days, Daniel went about his work and came home in the evenings and cooked simple dinners and left a portion for Sophia without comment. He did not withdraw his warmth. He did not become cold or clinical or distant in the way that people sometimes do when they are building a case against someone. He simply waited, with the kind of patient steadiness that Sophia now recognized as the most direct inheritance his father had given him. She had spent those 4 days doing something she hadn't done in years, thinking about herself with genuine honesty rather than with the practiced narrative she had long maintained. She thought about her choices, not just the one at the gate, but the accumulation of smaller choices that had led to it. The way she had always categorized people by their usefulness to her position. The way she had read rooms her whole adult life, not for warmth, but for advantage. The way she had treated kindness in others as a resource to be managed rather than a quality to admire. She had not been a monster. She had been something more ordinary and in some ways more troubling. Someone who had mistaken ambition for identity and appearance for character, and had done it so thoroughly and for so long that she had stopped being able to tell them apart. On the 5th morning, she sat across from him at the kitchen table with no makeup and no performance and told him the truth. That she had seen a man who looked like poverty, and poverty had always felt like her greatest threat. And so she had responded to threat the way she had always responded, by eliminating it before it could eliminate her. That she had been so busy becoming who she wanted to be seen as, that she had never stopped to ask who she actually was. That she was terrified, had always been terrified, and cruelty had been the disguise she wore over that fear for so long she had forgotten it was a disguise at all. Daniel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "My father grew up with nothing," he finally said. "He slept on a floor until he was 11 years old. He built everything we have with nothing but his own hands and his refusal to give up. And when he had more than he ever imagined, he chose to give most of it away and live simply, because he said it was the only way he knew how to stay honest." He looked at her. "He is the finest person I have ever known. And you made him feel unwelcome at my wedding because of his shoes." Sophia nodded. There was nothing to add to that. George visited the house the following week. He came alone with no announcement, the same way he did everything. Sophia opened the door herself. They stood facing each other in the doorway for a moment. The woman who had dismissed him and the man who had said nothing in return. "May I come in?" he asked simply. She stepped aside. They sat in the living room and George declined the tea she offered and asked her instead about her parents, where she grew up, what her father did. He asked with genuine curiosity, no trace of interrogation in his voice. Sophia answered carefully at first, then more fully. She told him about her childhood neighborhood, about her mother's patience and her father's quiet pride, about the hunger she had carried since she was old enough to understand what a surname could open and what the absence of one could close. George listened the way very few people had ever listened to her, completely, without waiting for his turn to speak. When she finished, he said, "Your parents sound like people of enormous character. You have more to be proud of than you've been allowing yourself to see." She looked at him. "How are you not angry with me?" He was quiet for a moment, as though the question deserved the respect of genuine consideration. "Because anger at you wouldn't give me back anything I lost. And I didn't lose much. I've been treated as invisible before. Most people who have lived as I've lived in recent years have. What I'm more interested in is whether you can see it now. Not because I need you to apologize to me, but because you will spend the rest of your life meeting people in worn shoes. And what you do in those moments is what you actually are." Sophia felt the words land somewhere deep and undefended. She did not cry this time. She simply nodded. And for the first time in a very long time, the nod was honest. The months that followed were not easy. There was no swift and tidy resolution. Daniel and Sophia did not simply reconcile over a dinner and agree to forget the morning. What happened instead was slower and less cinematic. A series of conversations, some painful, a few that ended badly before they ended better. A gradual learning of how to be honest with each other without the performances they had both, in their own ways, been giving. Daniel took her to meet his father properly, at the modest apartment George kept on the edges of the city before his next journey. The three of them ate a simple dinner around a small table, and George told stories about the places he had been. Villages in the mountains where he helped build water systems, coastal towns where he worked alongside fishermen to repair what storms had broken. He spoke about the people he'd met with a warmth and specificity that made them feel entirely real, as if they were all present in that small room with them. Sophia listened and felt something shift inside her that she didn't yet have words for. On the drive home, she said to Daniel, "He is the most genuinely wealthy person I have ever been in a room with." Daniel looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said, "he always has been." There was a morning, several months later, when Sophia went alone to the community center 3 blocks from her old neighborhood, the one her mother had volunteered at every Saturday when Sophia was young. She hadn't been back in years. The building looked exactly as she remembered it. A faded yellow door, a handwritten notice board by the entrance, the smell of coffee and old carpet. She walked in and asked if they needed help with anything. They handed her a stack of envelopes to sort and a chair to sit in, and she sat quietly among people who had no idea who she had married or what her husband's family name opened. She sorted envelopes for 2 hours and listened to the conversations around her, and went home feeling something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not pride, not status. Something quieter and more sustaining than either of those things. She went back the following Saturday, and the one after that. One of the regular volunteers, an older woman named Margaret who had been coming every week for 11 years, eventually asked Sophia what brought her in. Sophia thought about the question for a moment and said, simply, "I realized I had been avoiding somewhere I should have been going all along." Margaret nodded as though this were a perfectly ordinary answer, and asked if she wanted more envelopes. It was perhaps the most welcome she had felt in years. George returned to the city the following spring for a different kind of occasion. Not a wedding this time, but a small family dinner that Sophia had arranged herself. She had cooked, genuinely cooked, something she hadn't done since university. She had called her mother for the recipe, and her mother had been so surprised she asked 3 times if Sophia was feeling well. The table was set simply. There were no place cards, no flowers ordered from the expensive florist downtown. Just food and people who mattered. George arrived in his canvas bag and his practical shoes and sat at the table and ate everything on his plate with great appreciation. Afterward, he helped carry dishes to the kitchen, which Sophia tried to prevent, and he cheerfully refused to allow. As they stood together at the sink, washing up side by side in the ordinary way of people who have arrived at a real understanding of each other, George said quietly, "You're a good woman, Sophia. You got turned around for a while. A lot of people do. The ones who find their way back are the ones worth knowing." Sophia looked at the water running over her hands. "I almost threw away everything that actually matters," she said. "Almost," George said, "but you didn't." He handed her a dish to dry. "That's what counts." Daniel appeared in the kitchen doorway, watching the two of them for a moment before they noticed him. Something in his face settled. An ease he hadn't fully felt since the morning of the wedding finally returned to him. He stepped into the kitchen and put a hand on each of their shoulders. No words were needed. Later that evening, after George had gone and the table had been cleared and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Sophia stood at the window and thought about a man in worn shoes standing at a gate, looking for someone he loved. She thought about the ease with which she had dismissed him, about how quickly contempt had come to her, and how natural it had felt in the moment, and how that naturalness was the most frightening thing of all. She thought about her mother sorting envelopes every Saturday in a community center, not because anyone was watching, not because it opened any doors, but simply because it needed doing, and she had 2 hands and time. She thought about George washing dishes in her kitchen, refusing to be waited on, ordinary and extraordinary all at once. She thought about how the person she had most wanted to become, refined, elevated, belonging, had led her to a moment of such genuine ugliness that she could still feel it like a stone inside her chest when she pressed against it. And how the version of herself she had always dismissed, the girl from the neighborhood, the teacher's daughter, the one who knew what worn shoes felt like, was the one who had quietly been right the whole time. She did not make any grand declarations to herself. She did not decide to be a different person in one clean, decisive moment. That wasn't how it worked. She had learned that much. What she decided, standing at the window in the quiet of her own house, was simply to pay attention, to notice who she was becoming in the small moments, the unguarded ones, the ones where no one important was watching. To let those moments mean something. Outside, the city hummed with its usual indifferent energy. Somewhere out there was another old man in worn shoes, walking towards something that mattered to him. He would encounter people who saw right through him and people who saw him clearly. He would be dismissed and welcomed and ignored and recognized, sometimes all on the same day. And the people in those encounters would reveal, each time, exactly who they were. Character is not something you perform for an audience. It is not in the gown you wear, or the name you carry, or the guest list you curate. It is in what you do at the gate when no one you want to impress is watching. It is in the shoe you look at before you look at the face above it. It is in whether you ask the question at all. We don't choose the family we're born into or the shoes we start out wearing, but we choose every single day how we see the person standing in front of us. And that choice, quiet and ordinary and endlessly repeated, is the full measure of what we are. Where are you watching from today? Leave your city in the comments. Chicago, Atlanta, Detroit, Houston, Phoenix, Miami, or perhaps Manchester, Dublin, Cape Town, Nairobi, Sydney, Toronto, or Singapore. We want to know how far this story has traveled and whose heart it has found along the way. What do you think of this story? Write something in the comments for the person in your life who taught you what real dignity looks like. Maybe it's one sentence. Maybe it's just their name. Sometimes that's enough. Like this video, if it made you think differently about someone you've overlooked. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that character is the only wealth that truly lasts. Subscribe so you never miss a story that asks the questions worth asking. Thank you for watching until the end. You carry this story with you now. Use it well.